So in this video, I want to go ahead and walk through all of the different actions that the Fed can take and then how that will play out all the way through the aggregate supply and aggregate demand diagram. So let's say that the Fed decides to buy treasuries. They decide to buy $1 billion in treasuries. Well, the Fed will take $1 billion that it has in its vault and that it will give that to banks. And banks will in turn go ahead and lend that out to people. And in exchange, the banks will give the Fed treasuries, which weren't money to start with. So this will be an increase in the money supply because there's $1 billion more in the banks that the Fed bought the treasuries from. So that will be an increase in the money supply. And an increase in the money supply leads to an increase in aggregate demand because everyone has more money in their bank, so they think that they're going to go and spend it. Well, so they are going to go and spend it. They think that they're wealthier, and so they go and spend some of it. So an increase in aggregate demand, going down to this diagram, if aggregate demand goes from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, will lead to an increase in GDP from Y1 to Y2. So we have an increase in GDP, and we will have a decrease in interest rates. And the reason for this is that if aggregate demand, or if the money supply has increased, there is more money that is going ahead and chasing the same number of investments, is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that the Fed went ahead and bought treasuries. So because the Fed bought treasuries, it is increasing the price of treasuries, which means then that the interest rates will be lower. So either way, we're going to have lower interest rates. All right, so what if we do the opposite? We sell $1 billion in treasuries. Well, the Fed will be selling treasuries to the public and taking in dollars. So this will be a decrease in the money supply, which will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, which will lead to a decrease in GDP, and an increase in the interest rates because the Fed was selling a bunch of treasuries, so that will lower the price of treasuries, which will then increase the interest rate. Okay, so what about if it decides to increase the reserve requirement? Well, increasing the reserve requirement is going to lower the money supply because banks now have to hold more of their deposits on hand so they can loan out less. So that will decrease, and sorry, I wanted to keep this color-coded. So this will decrease the money supply. And decreasing the money supply will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, which will lead to a decrease in GDP. And here what's happened is that we have decreased the money supply. So in the same way as up here, we're going to have an increase in the interest rates. And the way to think about this here is that the interest rates on bonds are basically the amount that the bond pays you divided by how much you had to pay for the bond. So if there's less money in the entire world, those bonds are going to be cheaper. The prices of the bonds are going to be less. So the interest rate that you're going to get on those bonds will be higher. Everything else held equal. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, let me know. It's kind of another video in and of itself that I didn't want to go into here, but I do want to talk about what the effect is here. So if it doesn't make sense, let me know and I'll go and do another video on it. Okay, so to decrease the reserve requirement, that will lead to an increase in the money supply because banks now have to hold less money. And an increase in the money supply leads to an increase in aggregate demand, which will lead to an increase in real GDP and a decrease in interest rates. Okay, what about if we increase the discount rate? Well, increasing the discount rate makes it more expensive to borrow, right? It makes it more expensive for banks to borrow from the Fed, which will then also make it more expensive for us to borrow from the banks. So this is going to be a decrease in the money supply because when it's more expensive to borrow, less people are going to borrow. So that will be a decrease in the money supply. Decrease in the money supply leads to a decrease in aggregate demand, which leads to a decrease in GDP. And again, we said that increasing the discount rate is going to increase interest rates. So here interest rates increase. And finally, a decrease in the discount rate, well, we know that that will be a decrease in interest rates, and it will be an increase in the money supply, and that will be an increase in aggregate demand and an increase in GDP. So if any of that doesn't make sense, let me know, and I will see you in the next video.